Remarks. The first is that the title of my paper has changed slightly, as you can possibly see, to Conjunctions between Early Modern English Radicalism and Western Esotericism. I won't go into a long-winded explanation because I'm aware that you're probably quite like a cup of tea soon, so I would just say a couple of remarks. Firstly, I think that commemorating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, thank you, Simon. In my view, in Western Europe, the Reformation is the most important event in terms of its long-term consequences between the fall of the Roman Empire and at least the French Revolution. And my original intention had been to do something that John has already attempted to sketch, which is namely to ask the question to what extent you can see a Reformation happening during the English Revolution of 1641 to 1660. Is there what was called a Magisterial and Radical Reformation, a sort of more mainstream Reformation and a more extreme Reformation? And as I began toying with this, I thought this is a very large project, and John's already attempted the project, so perhaps it would be superfluous when one person is in the room who's already attempted it to try and give my own version of it. So instead I thought I'd focus particularly on the English Revolution, but what I'd consider to be the main themes that have come out of my research during my career, which is a lot longer than you might think. So in this paper, I'm going to do the following. First of all, I'm going to provide you some working definitions of what are called radicalism and Western esotericism. Both are anachronistic. They're not terms that were used at the time. So it's a lot harder than it might appear. Secondly, I'm going to examine approaches. Look at the major ways in which scholars have attempted to study radicalism and esotericism, and suggest some comparisons between those approaches. Thirdly, I'm going to identify key characteristics, what I consider to have been the major features of these forms during the period of 1641 to 1660. Can you all hear me above the rain, I hope? Speak louder still. Okay. It's nothing at all approaching biblical proportions. And finally, I'm going to look at the word conjunctions. Finish by exploring the question of whether there was a strong connection between early modern English radicalism and esotericism, as is usually claimed, or not, which is probably more where I'm leaning towards. You've all heard the term radical. Radical was originally a word relating to a root or roots, which by the early modern period was used particularly in philosophy, astrology and philology, the study of the origins of words. Radical also signified origin, and hence fundamental qualities inherent in the nature or essence of a person or thing. As the historian Conall Condren has observed, however, radical only became a political term associated with thorough or far-reaching political and social reform towards the end of the 18th century. Indeed, it was apparently not until autumn 1819 that radicalism was coined by Jeremy Bentham. Nor was it a univocal word, for within a decade, radicalism meant not only the political views of characteristic of radicals, but thoroughness of method as well. So already historians have a problem. Should we talk about the mid-17th century using the language of the late 18th and early 19th century? What problems does it have if we use words that contemporaries didn't use? Are we distorting the past by trying to make it explicable to the present? Now, in terms of major approaches, there have been, I would suggest, three major approaches to the study of early modern English radicalism. I'm not the first person to suggest that, but I do think it's very helpful. Since the work of Christopher Hill, famous historian of radicalism, the author of The World Turned Upside Down, amongst many other works, particularly the varieties that manifested themselves during the English Revolution, English radicalism has indeed been associated with the world turned upside down. At the conference yesterday, in fact, we saw images of the world turned upside down by the self-proclaimed water poet John Taylor, where all things were inverted, the natural order had been turned upside down. So, to quote the editors of the Biographical Dictionary of British Radicals in the 17th century, radicalism was associated with those who sought fundamental change by striking at the very root of contemporary assumptions and institutions, so as to overturn the status quo and replace it with something uncorrupted, that while looking forward to an anticipated millennium or utopian variant, nonetheless drew inspiration from an imagined past. So it was both looking forwards and backwards. And that looking backwards was equally important. It looked backwards towards a prelapsarian purity of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the primitive Christianity of the apostles, the unadulterated text of Holy Scripture, the classical republicanism of ancient Rome, the imagined privileges enjoyed by freeborn Anglo-Saxons before the imposition of a so-called Norman yoke, and the fundamental and inalienable provisions of something that we celebrated in another mythology 2 years ago, namely Magna Carta, buttressed by precedent, common law and custom. Now, Hill's approach was emblematic of the first of these three categories of what has been called a substantive approach, by which we mean the following: that there was a continuous, identifiable, single English radical tradition, one moreover which stretched from the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 all the way through to the Chartists and the modern working class movement. Now, just going slightly off track, I would say that at a conference celebrating probably the 400th anniversary of the birth of the Leveller leader John Lilburn 2 years ago, it was attended by Jeremy Corbyn before he became leader of the Labour Party, and Jeremy Corbyn was quite insistent that the Levellers were a part of the heritage of the modern Labour Party. A great number of people today associated with the Labour Party, or in the past Tony Benn, would take part in the commemoration of the Levellers, and especially the mutiny at Burford in May. So for them it's very much a part of their tradition. The Diggers too. Now, this is a fabricated tradition, not in the sense entirely of invented, but rather like Michael was saying about Catholic martyrology, but constructed, one that helps explain as much about the present as it does about the past. It's also malleable, it's flexible, and it owes a great deal to the accomplishments of Hill and his colleagues and a group of what was briefly influential, known as the Historians Group of the Communist Party. By contrast to this substantive approach, there's a nominalist approach. This is associated with the revisionists. Their interpretation of English history in early modern England stressed consensus and contingency rather than class or ideological conflict. So it was circumstances that explained political instability, events rather than class. So prominent figures within what might be termed the canonical English radical tradition were regarded as unrepresentative of the conforming, traditionalist, uncommitted majority. For them, the big thing was neutralism. Most people didn't want to take a side, most people were not extreme. Even in the cases of the radicals, it was argued that their extreme opinions were advocated only for a brief period of their lives. Most famously in the dismissal of Gerard Winstanley as basically a radical for only 2 or 3 out of his years. I don't believe it, neither does Chris, we'll return to it later. And that their influence was on society, this was like the Daily Mail version of history, was exaggerated by panicked political people worried about fear of property damage and cautioning about the dangers of introducing religious toleration, read immigrants from modern day, and its corollary, moral dissolution. So the idea here is that propaganda has exaggerated the fear of these people and that they were not as important as we might believe. At its most extreme, revisionists shaded into this nominalist approach, the idea that radicalism did not exist until it was named. So because the term was much later, it couldn't possibly have existed. Something existed, but it had been blown out of all proportion. A third way, a more moderate way, is the functionalist, which can be seen as a sort of an intermediary step between the substantive and the nominalist. This argues that radicalism did exist in this period, and at certain times and places, and it should be recognised by the functions it performs. For me, this provides a persuasive explanation for the defeat of radicalism in the aftermath of the English Revolution. So in 1660, radicalism failed because it did not sufficiently delegitimise the old monarchical order, the established church, and the traditional basis of society. In other words, it didn't go far enough. It failed because, unlike in France and the Terror of Robespierre, there was not a wholesale slaughter of royalists. Had there been a complete and utter slaughter of the defeated, radicalism may well have established itself, or, in the case of the French Revolution, become eaten by its own children. So if a measure of canonical English radicalism's transformative potential was not merely to turn the world upside down but to eradicate it, then part of its failure must be attributable to something else that only historians are recently turning attention to: moderation, compromise and restraint, the quest for settlement. Its own ability to seek compromise proved the seeds of its destruction. That's an interpretation. So ultimately in this section I want to suggest that radicalism's helpfulness as a category for explaining the past is problematic. I'm one of these people who's tried not to define radicalism, because every historian who's tried to define radicalism has run into a problem, because nobody likes their definition. So instead, what I want to suggest is the following. It gives, with one hand, comprehensibility, coherence and homogeneity, but it takes away with the other: anachronism, inconsistency and heterogeneity. Moreover, it's worth emphasising that radicalism is strongly dependent upon context. This was very much the theme of several contributors to a volume I co-edited. And since context matters in distinguishing between, at one extreme, the demand for fundamental revolutionary transformation, and at the other, gradual evolutionary change, it's also helpful in clarifying the mutable relationship between radicalism and reform, which is something I'm going to return to. So, let's park the idea of radicalism for a moment, and bear in mind, of course, that the Reformation definitely had its own radical strand, and talk about something which we are now calling, or at least some people are calling, Western esotericism. And here too we can think about the Reformation. Those of you who are familiar with the Reformation will know that after Luther, after Melanchthon, there are also other figures that used to be called spiritual reformers: Caspar Schwenkfeld, Valentin Weigel, Jakob Böhmer, and in a later iteration, Johann Arndt as well. And some of these people had a notable reception in England during the Revolution, and some a minor reception. Now, what exactly do I mean by esotericism? So, this too has problems in definition. Esoteric technically means philosophical doctrines and so forth appropriate to an inner circle of privileged disciples. Its etymology associates it with Pythagoras' advanced auditors, the esoterics, unlike those hearers under probation who was known as the exoterics. And this reflects both the nouns and the adjectives' use in 17th and early 18th century English. The first recorded English usage that I found, either of esotericism or esotericism with a different spelling, dates from the mid-1830s. So you've got there 1835, 1838. Slightly later than the French, l'esotericism and esoteric in German. Whereas esoteric and exoteric are being used consistently throughout the period, notably by the Cambridge Platonists during the 1650s and 1660s. So you can see we've got another problem here if we want to talk about esotericism during the English Revolution. Now, Western esotericism is something fairly new in the academy. It's people who couldn't get jobs in the 1960s and the 1970s because they studied things that their colleagues weren't interested in: witchcraft, the occult, alchemy, astrology, etc. So they decided to band together and form a society which would eventually give them enough power to be able to lobby for positions. And now quite a few of them are getting established as historians become much more interested in these things. In fact, I teach a course on magic, alchemy, angels, you name it. But if you're going to teach it, you're going to have to define what on earth it is you're talking about. So I'm going to give you the classic and now much disputed definition of modern Western esotericism. It's called Western so that they don't have to deal about esotericism in Indian religions, which was going to complicate the definition. And this was formulated by the French historian Antoine Fèvre, who was then holder of the chair in the history of esoteric and mystical currents at the Sorbonne. According to Fèvre's working model, it's a form of thought present in Christian culture from the Renaissance until today. which is identifiable by the simultaneous presence of 4 fundamental characteristics, which I've outlined there. The idea of universal correspondences, so this is the idea that things connect with each other. The idea of living nature, which is again quite common today, that nature is really alive, that the earth is actually a function. Think of the Gaia hypothesis, for example, in relation to climate change. The role of mediations and the imagination. This, for example, links it with romantic poetry, Coleridge, for example. This could be considered esoteric. And the experience of transmutation, transformation. So this, for example, helps explain the incorporation of alchemy. In addition, he identified 2 secondary characteristics: the practice of concordance, which I'm not sure what he meant, but if anybody wants to enlighten me, I'm sure that they can, and transmission. Like all traditions, it has to get from A to B, which is fine. This definition has been rightly criticised for being vague, arbitrary, and static, not to say circular, and that it's restrictively chronological and geographical, all of which I think are completely fair. But it was at least an attempt to come up with it. There have been further attempts to define esotericism, and I'll spare you the major sort of... it would take too long to outline them. Instead, what I'm going to identify is the commonly agreed components of Western esotericism. So what is it that we mean when we talk about esotericism? It's a catch-all term, just like radicalism. So it includes magic, alchemy, astrology, the Corpus Hermeticum, which is a series of writings attributed to an Egyptian god called Hermes Trismegistus, which we in fact now know to have been written over about 6 centuries by multiple different hands in different languages. Christian Kabbalah, occult philosophy, so literally hidden philosophy, the reception of the Swiss medical theologian Paracelsus, the Rosicrucian manifestos, which was one of the biggest hoaxes that went out of control of the mid-17th century. There were no real Rosicrucians before anybody tells me that there were. Christian theosophy, Freemasonry in Illuminism in the later century, New Age spirituality, 19th century occultism. Now, interesting things to me as an outsider coming to the study of esotericism, because I'm interested in all these things and many of these things are happening during the English Revolution, is that they've got exactly the same problems defining their field as people interested in radicalism have as well. And I've identified 3 major approaches to the study of Western esotericism, just as there are 3 major approaches to the study of radicalism. And in fact, they're essentially utterly comparable. The first is the religionist, which I think is utterly comparable to the substantive. So the idea for many of the Marxists and their fellow travellers and members of the Labour Party today that there is a coherent substantive radical tradition was very important for their identity. In the same way, a number of people interested in these topics are interested in them because they believe them to be true. They believe that magic works, they believe that alchemy works, they believe in astrology. And they've been called by the by the historian of this subject, Wouter Hanegraaff, the religionist approach. It's characterised, in his words, by an inability, or a summary of his words, an inability to distinguish between the study of esotericism and its practice, often manifested as a spurious claim to superior knowledge of esoteric doctrines and rituals by believers with a proselytizing tendency. For some of these believers, I think they also share another quality with people who were involved in the substantive process with radical history. For the people who believed that radicalism mattered, they were recovering a lost past to challenge what they believed to be the history of the dominant ruling class, a sort of a working class countercultural challenge to a dominant history. In the same way, for religionists, they were trying to recover a past that they believed had been suppressed by ecclesiastical authority, and particularly the Catholic Church. You only have to look at, for example, the popularity of the Da Vinci Code to see how you can have a history that purports to be a secret history that has been suppressed, and that the true history will actually reveal what happened. A second approach, which I think is again a nice persuasive way of looking at the purpose of esotericism, is to think of it as functionalist. By which I mean that esoteric texts images, rituals, musical compositions, artifacts, architectural designs. You look at Freemasonry and garden design, landscape gardens. The best way to think about it is not that it gives us a pathway into the past that's been suppressed, but by the functions it performs. So what I mean is that it's a way in which knowledge is transmitted. These people believed it came from a higher form of knowledge, from deities or angels, etc. But it's a way of transmitting knowledge which goes back to the etymology, the idea of from initiate, from disciple to a disciple, so esoteric in that sense. And here it's worth underlining a point that again is similar to radicalism. This knowledge to the believers is a hidden truth which has the potential to challenge established forms of power, whether that be church power or state power. You think about the banning of astrological prophecies predicting the death of priests and popes and monarchs. It has the power to challenge authority, the power of revelation, to say you have a revelation from God saying that the worldly powers will be shaken. A third approach, again, is comparable to sort of the ultra-revisionist, and that's to say that Western esotericism is a nonsense. It's an academic construction, and it didn't exist until it was named. It doesn't mean anything, it's merely a scholarly construction that exists in the minds of intellectuals and perhaps some of the wider public, but it doesn't actually help us get it any closer to reality. I don't think that's particularly helpful, although I do think that Western esotericism has a serious problem in actually deciding what it is. But I do think that it does actually have something within it that is interesting and that it does need at least talking about in general terms. Now, going back to radicalism and then linking it through. So through my research, I've sort of tried to identify what I think are the major significant components of early modern radicalism, particularly during the English Revolution. For convenience, I've put them in red. I hope you can see them all. And relevant to this centre, I think apocalypticism is absolutely key, and this is of course also present in the Reformation. So claims of divine, messianic or prophetic status. There are people worshipped as God during this period. They're usually imprisoned, I have to say. There are people who claim to be giving birth to the Messiah, and they too are imprisoned. Less extreme than that, there are people claiming to be given extraordinary divine and prophetic gifts, including, it has to be said, the gift of tongues and the ability to speak all languages, but not necessarily to understand what they're saying. That can vary. There is, again, just as with the Reformation, I think a very strong strand of going down rather than across, Christian primitivism. Not just exclusive, I mean, talking to John about this, not just exclusively linked to the radicals, but certainly prevalent in the radicals. So the idea to returning to a pure church uncorrupted by popery is very strong in this period. There is the belief in latter-day apostles. A lot of people in this period are claiming that they are the new apostles. That just as the apostles of Christ had been fishermen and tent makers, such as Paul, so the new chimney sweeps, one thing of Tinker of Bedford, Bunyan, the soap boilers, the mechanics, the tradesmen, these are the new apostles sharing the lowly occupations with Christ's first apostles. Another is community of goods. One only has to think of the diggers on St. George's Hill who share all their goods. In their mind, they're imitating apostolic practice. There is, I've got New Testament experts here, so I need to be very, very cautious in what I say. But as far as I'm aware, there is precedent in the Bible for this belief. They're against, and this is some of John's work here, they're against the persecuting church. The church is not a persecutory church, and they're, in modern language, pacifist. They don't believe in violence, they believe in non-resistance. Not all of them, of course. I mean, I've previously talked about the violence in Thomas Benner's writing, but some of them. Like the Reformation, there is certainly what we today call anti-clericalism, another anachronism. There is a strong resistance to the idea of university-educated clergy. The idea, and you see this today as well, that intellectuals have a monopoly of knowledge. In this period, it's the idea that people who went to university, who understood Latin and Greek and Hebrew, the languages of the Bible and the Vulgate, somehow knew more about the Bible than people who believed themselves to be inspired by Christ at the time. So there's strong opposition. You see this a lot, for example, in Quaker writing. Linked to that was the idea of a clergy that could have tithes. that the laity would give the clergy money. Ministers, in extreme cases, according to the Baptists, had to work with their hands, earn a living, or else they should be sustained through voluntary rather than obligatory contributions. Another strong sense here is a moving from outward forms of religious observance. And here again you see this a lot, for example, in Quakers. So churches no longer become the house of God. For these people, you can worship in the open spaces, you can worship in the fields, you can meet in a house rather than a church. That the church is the believers rather than the structures that's holy. And there's a move against the actual rituals. So the baptism of infants, which we see again in the Reformation, strong resistance to it, and in extreme cases the actual idea of baptism itself. So not even adult baptism is helpful. There is definitely a move against the idea of using the Lord's Supper. Again, Quakerism doesn't have a Lord's Supper. Against the idea of a Book of Common Prayer. Against the idea of the Sabbath on a Sunday, or even in extreme cases that the Sabbath should be celebrated. One sees this in a number of instances in Sabbath breaking. The Diggers, for example, it's often forgotten, England's first communists, that they begin on a Sunday. They break the ground on a Sunday. They're not only communists, but they're Sabbath breakers. The idea of swearing oaths, this again is also very familiar in Quakers. I won't get into too much detail about this one, but there's a very interesting, and just as in the Reformation, relationship to Jewish law. Christians divide Jewish law into the Mosaic, the judicial, and the ceremonial. The Mosaic are the Ten Commandments. The judicial are laws which Christians believe are no longer incumbent upon Christians to observe, but they're still helpful and interesting nonetheless, and the ceremonial are ones in which they should have no function whatsoever. So the Ten Commandments, by and large, most Christians in this period believe still need to be observed, that it would not be a good idea going around killing people and committing adultery and stealing, although some people do all three. The judicial, a good example would be the Blasphemy Act of 1648, and again, which has the death penalty for blasphemy in England, which is prescribed in Leviticus, if I remember correctly. It's not a law that they have to have, but it's a law that they think is useful to have, and then they moderate it to 6 months imprisonment. And the ceremonial is things such as dietary restrictions, restrictions on whether you can wear mixed fibres in your clothing. But it also leads to an alternative, which I haven't talked about, which I'll say very briefly, of Judaizing, of some Christians at the time of the apocalypse actually adopting Jewish customs. So some Baptists will celebrate the Sabbath not on a Sunday, but on a Saturday. In extremis, some men circumcise themselves. Certainly a lot of these people also adopt Jewish dietary customs. There's a black pudding debate about whether you can eat bacon and whether you can eat blood. So this is also happening. Attitudes towards Christian magistrates is also shifting, and again, just as in the Reformation. There is a strong sense here that magistrates, that the state, civil authority, is not to interfere in matters of personal belief, that the liberty of conscience, that individuals have the right to be able to determine their own faith without persecution. And the state eventually moves to the position that so long as a believer keeps that belief private and doesn't disrupt the state, that's fine. As long as you don't try and rebel, you can believe what you want. And they even move away from trying to... there are a couple of test cases that do test their patience. There is a Quaker called James Naylor, some of you may have heard of, who rides into Bristol on horseback in imitation of Christ entering Jerusalem, whose followers claim that he is the new Jesus. They don't execute him, though he does get horribly tortured and mutilated. It's one of those tricky ones for Cromwell. Another thing, and again, just like with the Reformation, there is certainly a willingness to endure persecution amongst these radicals. There is martyrdom in extremis, or in Naylor's case, sufferings. Quakers keep extensive records of their sufferings. While, and John will reaffirm this, nobody is burned at the stake for England during this period. The last person burned at the stake that we know of was in 1612. There will be somebody executed in Scotland for denying the Trinity, but he's not burned at the stake. But they do nonetheless suffer in a number of other ways. Imprisonment, which can be a death sentence given the conditions of prisons in this time. And in fact, More than 1,500 people die as a result of their imprisonment shortly after the Restoration. Fines, so you can be reduced to penury. Whipping certainly happens. Branding with a letter B for blasphemer happens very rarely, but it still happens. Exile. Some people are sent to the Caribbean for their beliefs at this period, which, given the conditions of the time, was again possibly akin to a death sentence. And there's a culture of record keeping. For the first time, the sort of creation of a martyrology. Again, the Quakers are the best at this, in sort of keeping a record of all these sufferings. Just as with the Reformation, another really important sense is the individual rather than the community. Communities are important, but individual experience is now also extremely important. So, conversion narratives, this sense of introspection, melancholy, severe depression, before a transformation. There are reported spiritual deaths and rebirths, to use the language of Quakerism, convincement. And for a number of people, there is a belief that they're actually being guided by the Holy Spirit or the inner light of Christ within them. There's also, and literary scholars have done magnificent work in bringing this out, certainly radical and new forms of literary expression. There's new prose and verse style. This is probably, I would say, the most vibrant period. People who've worked on Elizabethan drama will probably disagree, but I'm going to repeat myself. This is probably the most vibrant, certainly for prose, the most vibrant period of English prose for a long period. It's the age of Milton, but a whole host of other writers as well in verse. There's the development of vocabulary specific to religious communities and movements, including the invention of new words to help describe their experiences. So there's certainly something radical happening with language at this point. There's also proselytizing. There's attempts to justify the idea that lay people can preach, not just the clergy, which is something we see in the Reformation. Experts in the Reformation may be able to help me out with this. I don't know about female preaching in the Reformation, but here there is certainly justification of female preaching. There are Baptists who preach who are women, there are Quaker women. There is certainly much more equality amongst the sects, so-called, for women than there is in the traditional Church of England. There is the use of emissaries and ministers to spread the word through preaching, and particularly important, the use of, just as in the Reformation, the use of print and the circulation of manuscript copying to spread the word. There is a reformist agenda. There are attempts for reforms in agriculture, in constitution, sometimes forgotten educational, as well as in the church. Electoral, one thinks of the famous Putney debates. Legal, harking back to this so-called Norman yoke. But also, and this is sometimes forgotten at the same time, medical. Traditional medicine is Galenic, it's humoral, it thinks of the four humours, and this challenges the monopoly of the College of Physicians through Paracelsian medicine. Major attempts at social reform, alleviating the state of the poor, putting them to work. Ideas of taxation reform, trade. I haven't actually got in there. Prison reform. This is a period, it's often forgotten, you can be imprisoned for debt. So I think by that token, all students should go to jail. An argument for free education, if ever I heard one. As well as that, there are polemical constructions and stereotypes when one thinks of their enemies. Now, the enemies represent them very much in a tradition of writing, anti-heretical writing that goes all the way back to Epiphanius of Salamis, but more famously Augustine against the Manichees and others. And Anne Hughes has shown very well how the writers against these people, the anti-heretical writers, are drawing on a tradition in the mid-17th century. And of course, one also has to think of Luther and particularly Calvin writing against exactly the same type of people, what they believe to be the same type of people. Now, this has a number of characteristics, and one of the most interesting things about what their enemies say about them is not that what they say is accurate, because often it's not. It's that if you reverse what they say, in fact, if you invert it, you get a model of what their enemies believe to be the perfect truth. So in fact, they see these errors as an inversion of the perfect church, of the perfect individual. These enemies use a lot of labels to help categorization. So there's a whole load of long lists of various denominations and sects, which have no bearing on reality, but they help their enemies get a sense of navigating their way through these. And what is it they emphasize? They emphasize blasphemous religious beliefs and rituals, diabolic inspiration, sinful conduct, especially sexual immorality. Baptists are often accused of male Baptist preachers are baptizing women in rivers and then having sex with them afterwards because their clothes are wet and they have to take them off. Just read Daniel Featley's Dip is Dipped, it's all there. Mental instability, that you have to be mad to join one of these religions, that these people aren't honest, they're liars, they're dissimulators, not only that, but they're disloyal to the state, and that believing in this will actually lead to the world turned upside down disorder. So as I've said, if you reverse all that, you get divine truth, religious orthodoxy, constant devotion, sexual probity, virtuous conduct, and faithfulness. So, to bring it all together and try and conclude,